We bring to you our next speaker, a dyed-in-the-wool career conservationist turned professional speaker, an executive management coach with over 40 years of experience in wildlife management across Southern Africa, turning wildlife into business and business into wildlife. A raconteur of note who turns his rich lifetime of escapades into the wild places of Africa, into tantalizing tales of terror and triumph, adversity into advantage, and failure into fulfillment. As a highly experienced executive manager, having heading the large state-owned conservation enterprises, huge multi-million dollar international conservation projects, consulting to the United Nations and the World Bank, and more recently his own business, Growth Leaders Africa. And above and beyond those, assisting myriads of community SMMEs to become operational. He is well qualified to bring back the finer nuances of business leadership and wildlife ecology in a fun-filled stories of adventure and wild exploits. Ladies and gentlemen, we bring you Steve Johnson, otherwise known variously as the Wildlife Guy and the Elephant Whisperer, for a session of his wild.
I was sitting around the campfire in the old Monkwick camp one chilly evening with a group of eminent captains of industry. And they were there on a leadership course that I was running for them. And while we were sitting around the fire, all silent in their own introspection, looking at the flickering firelight, it came to me that I remembered an old saying that one of my Indibele mentors had once given me when I joined national parks in my early days. And he said, Silapa ngoba silapa. Silapa ukukondo. We are here because we are here. And we are here to understand. We are here to understand. And as I looked into the fire, I thought, I think I'll give them a story. A story from the wisdom of the waterhole about leadership and belonging. And so I pulled up my short little Batonka sitting stool closer to the fire, and I started my story. It was in 1964 that my family had immigrated from Zimbabwe to Cape Town. And we, in the December of that year, just before Christmas, one of my best friends back in Zimbabwe had phoned and said, why don't you come back to Zimbabwe and have Christmas with us on the farm like we traditionally did as a family? And so it was, 12 years old, confident as hell. I had my passport in my hand. I boarded a train in Cape Town and on my own took a 3-day journey back to my hometown. And when we arrived at the farm and I was greeted by my friend Rafe, I happened to see beyond him at the back 5 other young boys that I realized were from his boarding school and among previous visits to the farm. And beyond them were another 6 young girls. And in that moment, I realized I did not belong. We were playing around the pool under the gazebo. And the bully boy suddenly stood up and said, let's play a game. Let's play spin the bottle, one of those childish games that teenagers play. And he said, we need 6 girls and 6 boys, but there's 7 of us boys. And then he turned to me and he said, why don't you just leave us? Go climb the koppie, the hill behind the farmhouse, and just leave us alone. I turned to my best friend for support, but he wouldn't take my gaze. And so, embarrassed and humiliated, I walked off as tears welled up in my eyes and giggles from the girls behind mocking me, I went and climbed that kopje, sobbing and sobbing at being banished. And when I got to the top of the kopje, there was this magnificent, large, round rock that looked out over the Zimbabwean landscape. And I sat down there and I just sobbed and my shoulders shaking, and waves of rage and anger welled up from my belly at being treated so badly by my friends, being humiliated and banished. And after what seemed like an interminable time, suddenly a turtle dove alighted and landed on a branch just above me on my left and started to coo. And as it cooed, slowly that sound penetrated my broken mind. And a wonderful calmness just came over me. And I knew that I was all right. And in tear-misted eyes, I looked out over the landscape and I realized and I vowed that I would never again be banished to the wilderness by anyone else ever again. And in that beauty and the silence, I also vowed that I would commit my life to protecting the beautiful landscapes of Africa. And so it was, we finished the holiday and I traveled back to Cape Town and I put all my energy into realizing my new dream of becoming a game ranger. I excelled at school. I climbed all the mountains in the Western Cape. I was one of the first Springbok Boy Scouts. When I was doing my army training, I was selected to be part of the elite Parabat unit. And when I was ready, I returned in 1975 to Zimbabwe and I applied to join the National Parks Board. And I got no response. And I applied and I applied and I applied. And in that time, I'd got married and had a family. I realized I had to provide for them. And so I took a job in commerce. And I did very well. I was quite successful. And one day, a gray-haired old man in faded khaki uniforms came into the office and bought a door in the wood in timber shop that I was working in. And I realized he was from National Parks and we had a discussion. The next day, as I was at my desk, the phone rang. There was a lady's voice that said, would I be available to come for an interview that day at 11 o'clock at the National Parks head office. I was totally stunned. I asked my boss, can I take some time off? I jumped in my car and I raced across town like my life depended upon it. I was ushered into the offices. And as I got into the interview panel, I realized that the gray-haired old man in faded khakis was sitting there and he was actually the chief warden of the whole of the National Parks Board. They persuaded me to give up my career in commerce, and so I left that in the dust of Harare. And by 12 o'clock that same day, I had a letter of appointment, I had my pile of uniforms, and I had a lot of explaining to do to my wife that I changed my mind and my career. About 4 weeks later, beginning of January 1976, I found myself in the main camp of Hwange National Park. And on the day that I was supposed to report, Monday, I went to see the senior ranger and he took me in to meet the warden of the whole park, Norman Payne. And as we went into his office, he stood in front of his desk, he got up and he was coming around to greet me. And the senior ranger made the introductions and he said, Mr. Payne, this is Steve Johnson, our new ranger. Steve Johnson, this is Norman Payne. And having just come back from a successful commercial career, I put out my arm and my hand very confidently and I said, "Hi, Norman, it's nice to meet you." At which point he stopped abruptly, pulled his hand back, and he turned to the senior ranger, Mr. Coltman, and he said, "Mr. Coltman, I suggest that we send this young man on a 10-day patrol to the bottom of Whange National Park to teach him some respect and some humility. Get him to go and look after and fix the boreholes." My world came crashing down at my feet. On my first day of my dream job, I was banished to the wilderness. The next day found me driving in my Land Rover with my camping gear with the most wonderful man, Sergeant Petros Indlovu, who was on that trip supposed to be my security and my advisor and accomplice. And as we traveled through the undulating hillsides of the park, we passed through many herds of elephant, and Petros took great time to explain to me all about the structure of the herds, their social behavior, and all of the other animals that we passed along the way. He explained about the ecology of the park. And he also explained about the bureaucratic system, where the paramilitary processes of the park, which showed why I had actually failed in showing respect to the warden. After a few days, on the night of the third day, we were sitting around the fire after a beautiful meal that Petros had cooked. And he was sitting on his little Batonka stool, and he started to giggle and his shoulders started to shake. And I looked at him curiously out of the corner of my eye, wondering what was making him laugh. And as he picked up a broken stick from the ground and stirred his very sweet tea in his beaten up old enamel mug, and he took a sip, he said to me, "Did you notice that herd of elephants at the waterhole when we arrived at lunch today and sat under the tree?" And I said, "Yes, I'd seen the herd." And he said, "Did you notice that there were those younger cows there that were kind of shuffling the youngsters around and corralling them and keeping them safe?" I said, "I'd noticed that." And he giggled and he said, "Those are just like my auntie back in Chilocho, my home village. The one auntie always walks around with a stick, and if the little boys are naughty, she gives them a quick whack. And she thinks she's keeping them under control, but they actually are teasing her and they run off and they like to come back and get another bit of attention from her." And he said, "Did you notice the big elephant at the back that was always just around and not doing too much, but seeming to be the leader?" And I said, "Yeah, the matriarch." And he said, "That reminds me of my mother, also in that same village. She's always going around the village because the men are out working on the mines and just making sure everybody's looked after and that their well-being is cared for. And she used to sit us down at our fire in the village and tell us stories. And she used to tell us stories of the elephant herd. And she told us this one saying, "Imhlambini we Ndlovu, konke kungo kwakho. Konke kungo kwakho." And that was, in an elephant herd, everybody belongs and no one is ever left behind. And that stuck in my mind from that day on. It was a few days later that we got a message on the radio from the office saying that I had to return to a very important meeting urgently the following day. And so we packed up and we raced back to main camp. We got there late that evening and I was fearful of a reprimand, a disciplinary hearing. I was in shock. As was required, I reported for duty that morning and went to see the senior ranger, and very seriously he escorted me to Norman Payne's office and knocked on the door, and a very gruff "Come in" came from inside, and I knew I was in deep trouble. And so as we walked in, he said, "Hi, Norman, I brought Stephen. You wanted to see him." And I was quite shocked at the informality suddenly. And so I looked at him plainly, and a big smile broke out on his face. "Sergeant Ndlovu says that you did a remarkable job on your trip down there fixing the boreholes and that you've passed the test. I'd like you to welcome you into the national parks, and we know you're going to be a great ranger." And he shook my hand, very tight grip. And he said, "Mr. Coltman, call in all of the other staff and give him a good welcome here." And as all of the other staff poured in and were congratulating me, I noticed Sergeant Ndlovu was sitting at the back with a big smile on his face. And I made my way through to him. And I said, "Thank you very much." And he said, "No, you've done a wonderful job, sir, and it's an honor to work with you. And just remember that saying of the elephant herd, that everybody belongs and no one's ever left behind." And he then reached down and picked up his little Batonka stool and he handed it to me. And he said, "This is because you have many stories to tell." And that story, everybody was in their reflective mode, nodding their heads. They were understanding. And a voice from one, and I nodded, and I reached down and was feeling it. And I said, "Yes, because it inspires me and brings wisdom from the water hole. Because everybody needs to belong." Thank you.